Reading from the book of Job, chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it." In 1952, Florence Chadwick, a seasoned long-distance swimmer, attempted to swim the 26 miles between Catalina Island and the California coast. The water was cold, the fog thick, and after 15 hours of swimming, she begged to be taken out of the water. Though she was physically and emotionally drained, she said later that the breaking point came because she could not see the shore. Her words were, "If I could have seen the shore, I would have made it." Sometimes suffering makes us feel exactly like that. Blinded by the fog of pain, unable to see the end. And when there is no end in sight, death can seem like the only release. This is where we meet Job in chapter 3. After losing everything, his wealth, his servants, and his beloved children, and being struck with a painful disease from head to toe, Job opens his mouth not to curse God, but to wish that he had never been born. Job had reached the limits of human endurance. The pain in his body and the silence of God became unbearable. Initially, Job held his peace even after his wife's words, "Curse God and die." Now, surrounded by his friends, and perhaps feeling the freedom to unburden himself, he lets his grief pour out. Proverbs 10:19 warns us, "When words are many, transgression is not lacking. But whoever restrains his lips is prudent." But Job's speech is the cry of a broken man grasping for meaning. Job has no idea why this has happened to him, nor does he know when and how this suffering will end. There is no clarity, no light at the end of this very dark tunnel. So Job laments the day of his birth. He asks 3 questions that arise all too commonly in the hearts of many who suffer. He questions, "Why was I ever born?" He doesn't curse God, but he does question the reason that God allowed his birth. His suffering is so great that his past seems unnecessary and meaningless. His words express his deep desire that his life had never begun. But we cannot truly grasp what it means not to be born. We only know life. The comparison between living, even with suffering, and never having been born is too big for us. But then, in such moments, it's not logic that speaks, it's anguish. Second, Job asks why, having been born, he was not allowed to die, since his life seemed fated to end in meaningless suffering. "Why did I not die at birth?" he asks. For a man like Job, who lived righteously, who was known for his kindness to the poor and his justice for the oppressed, this is a heartbreaking situation. He had lived well, loved deeply, and walked with integrity. Yet, in his grief, all the good in his life seemed to disappear behind the towering wall of pain. Grief often blurs our perspective and makes it seem that our lives have made no difference in the world. It is hard to remember that just because we lose sight of the goodness doesn't mean it didn't exist or that it didn't matter. Third, in verse 20, he asks, why is life given to those in misery? Why should someone in such anguish continue to live? In the view of the one who suffers, death would be a mercy. Job isn't just mourning, he is asking hard questions. Is there a point to suffering without explanation? What good is life when it's filled with bitterness? From his perspective, his life no longer serves a purpose, not to himself, not to others, and not even to God. The scriptural perspective points to something greater than our pain. Proverbs 16:4 says, the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. That means our lives, every part of them, have a purpose in God's hands, even the parts we cannot make sense of. Elijah, too, once wanted God to take his life when threatened by Jezebel after his sacrifice on Mount Carmel and the slaughter of the Baal priests. But God wasn't done with him, and he wasn't done with Job either. But Job's lament teaches us the immense value of godliness. In the moment of immense suffering, Job didn't sugarcoat his pain, but poured it out. Yet, his heart was still focused on God. All his thoughts were on God and what he was or was not doing in his life. And God can handle our rawest emotions. He prefers that to polite hypocrisy. Psalm 62 verse 8 tells us, pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Job lived before any scriptures were written. He had to rely on the knowledge of God he had gained from his forefathers, of a just, true, and good God who valued these qualities and rewarded those who sought his approval by living this way. He knew that God was the judge and that there would be a day of resurrection and judgment. Today, with the scriptures abundantly available, we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses who suffered and saw God's faithfulness. James chapter 5, verse 10 to 11 reminds us, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Third, there is a purpose in our seemingly meaningless suffering, though we cannot see it. Job's story is not just a story of sorrow, it's a story of endurance and eventual restoration. For the godly among the Israelites, their exile in Babylon was a dark season. But God had not abandoned them. He promised through Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a future and a hope. Jeremiah 29, verse 11. That was a reassurance of ultimate restoration. In the same way, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10 says, and after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. What do we do if we are faced with such darkness? We wait on God for relief, lean on his promises, and trust in his goodness. Isaiah 50 verse 10 says, let him who walks in darkness and has no light trust in the name of the Lord and rely on his God. This is persevering faith, not in the absence of suffering, but in the middle of it. Florence Chadwick didn't make it that day in 1952, but 2 months later, she tried again. This time, the fog was just as thick, but she made it, because this time, she kept a mental image of the shoreline the whole way. Job's suffering has provided just such a mental picture of the other side to millions of people through the ages. It reassures us about the presence and purposes of a faithful God who pities our tears, never prolongs pain without a reason, and finishes what he starts. Amidst intense suffering, it is tempting to prefer death to life. But let us, in the midst of anger and sadness, still cling to the God who holds our lives, even in suffering. For this is ultimately all that we need to do. He is faithful. He will strengthen those who trust him. Wait for him. Lean on him. Your shoreline is nearer than you think. And he who calls you is faithful. He will bring you safely home. God bless.